The books from McGraw-Hill, Perfection Learning, and various others, including Pearson, reportedly promote the idea that Moses definitely existed, where this should be taken as a matter of faith, and that he somehow inspired the U.S. Constitution, and this is a pervasive falsehood, frequently repeated, even though we can prove that that's not true. The list of commandments beginning in Exodus 20 had no determinable influence over the formation of the American legal system. Killing and stealing were already illegal universally in every system of government, even prior to the alleged time of Moses. And apart from them, none of the other commandments in the list that is commonly and erroneously labeled the 10 have ever been represented in the laws of this land. Moses is a compilation of at least a few legendary heroes and evidently never existed otherwise. He is no more a historic figure than King Arthur. Even rabbinical scholars now admit that there is an archaeological consensus that the way the Bible describes the Exodus is not the way it happened, if it happened at all. And then, as had been mentioned previously, worldview software mentions a Hamitic race which never existed. It was imagined out of nothing and imagined to have come from an imaginary person. 19th century bigots refused to accept that the civilization of Egypt could have been built by, quote, Negroes, which is a wholly inappropriate pejorative for a textbook. These type racial classifications were rejected initially by Darwin, shortly after by Boas, and then the whole of anthropology. We in the 21st century must, of course, reject it also. Hello. 4 years ago, I addressed this board explaining that Moses is a character from religious folklore, not from history. Since that meeting, I've reviewed what's been written into our textbooks with historians and Bible scholars to again confirm that it is inappropriate to teach students that Moses was ever really real, much less assert when he was born, since even those who believe in him can't agree on when that should have been. The fables about Moses certainly did not inspire the U.S. Constitution either. The so-called 10 Commandments have no appreciable correlation with American law. Most of them are unenforceable violations of our constitutional rights. The First Commandment contradicts the First Amendment, for example. Moses would have strongly objected to our Bill of Rights and virtually every aspect of our secular democratic republic if he was a real person, but there is now a growing consensus of archaeologists and other experts, including even rabbinical scholars, who say that he evidently never existed at all. In the 5th chapter of my book, Foundational Falsehoods of Creationism, I cite several of the founding fathers speaking against state-imposed religious instruction and against Christianity in particular, where Thomas Jefferson explained how he meant to establish a wall of separation between church and state. And perhaps that's why this board sought to remove Thomas Jefferson and replace him with Jefferson Davis, who famously used the Bible to justify slavery and who also explicitly stated that slavery was the reason for the Civil War, which is what we're, instead of states' rights, which is what we're teaching now. It is immoral to mislead sequestered students with misrepresented misinformation. This is why I'm for revising our standards in our textbooks, to take out the errors that I and so many others told you then shouldn't be there in the first place. Thank you.
I want to show my support today for Work Group D's recommendations on the TEKS 1B and 1C in the high school U.S. government course. They pointed out a concern about bias in crediting Moses or Judeo-Christian and biblical law as having informed our nation's founding. I'm sure that the board has heard historical quotes to the contrary many times from many of our founding fathers, including President John Adams, who said, "The government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion." He was there at the time period, so he must know a thing or two about it. But you say, what about the 10 Commandments? Adams here too specified in a letter to Thomas Jefferson that our legal system is not based on the 10 Commandments. Since we want to specify what our children learn here today, a quick quiz for the adults. Is the U.S. either a monarchy or a theocracy like the form of government in the Bible? The 10 Commandments clearly specifies that the worship of the God of the Bible only was allowed. Another question, are people that don't worship that God, including law-abiding and tax-paying citizens, not protected by our Constitution? Are other religions or the non-religious not protected by the Constitution at all, as they would not be by biblical law? I could quote more founding fathers on the topic of the secular nature of our government, but maybe some board members would want to delete them too. What happened in our history may stay rewritten and factually incorrect today, but you can't change what actually happened. It's not about what makes everyone feel better about what they want to believe. Once as a teacher, I was talking to an administrator about someone teaching our students that the earth was biblically created in thousands of years. I told them that that conflicts with the state science standards. For example, Earth and space science teachers were just one. They responded that they have your opinion and you have yours. If we do not remove these inaccuracies from the standards today, we're forcing teachers to mislead students about the facts of our nation's secular founding. The state standards must be a reliable and accurate tool for students. That way we can better ensure Texas students are given the most accurate education possible. I have one final question for the board to ponder. If you do not delete inaccurate, misleading information of the state standards now, what will history write about this school board later? Thank you.
Amy Jo Baker.
Yes, I have, is it on? Okay. I have copies for each of the board members and the staff of 36 pages of recommendations for K through 12 in terms of the information, but I would like to spend my time refuting what the Texas Freedom Network and atheists said about the role of Judeo-Christian heritage and the Ten Commandments in our, specifically removing it from government. There are so many principles found in the Bible that influence the basis of all of our American laws. Just a few include the existence of objective moral values, fixed standards, absolute truth, the sanctity of life found in the Declaration of Independence, and also the truths endowed by our Creator. Specifically in Article 1, Section 7 of the Constitution is a direct reference to the fourth commandment, the day of the president not signing a bill on a Sunday. The statutes of many of our states have prohibitions against blasphemy, the third commandment, dishonoring our parents, elder abuse laws, the fifth commandment, thou shalt not kill, murder, the sixth commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery, the legal basis for divorce, the seventh commandment, thou shalt not steal, the eighth commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor, the ninth commandment. Chief Justice Warren Burger stated that the Ten Commandments form the very basis of America's civil laws.
That really baffles me because there's no way you can say that if you have any kind of rudimentary understanding of separation of church and state, that you can say our laws are based on a commandment like that you shall have no other gods before me, namely Jehovah, the Hebrew God. You can't, that always struck me as astonishing that people wanted to put the Ten Commandments up in school classrooms. I mean, nobody has a problem with you shall not steal, you shall not murder, though these are so generic. It's almost like to say this is biblical. Well, yeah, but it's everybody else too. But when you start saying the government mandates that good Americans worship the Hebrew God. I mean, I wonder if people who say that have even read the Ten Commandments. This isn't a question of thinking that religion is insidious and all that. It's just saying these laws were promulgated in the context of a very ancient Middle Eastern theocracy. They're just not. I mean, it made some sense there, but it doesn't in any kind of a pluralistic society. And that's what or the Sabbath. I mean, do we have? I know there have been Sabbath laws, but that's it seems to me that's more pragmatic. The Sabbath is Saturday, of course, and there's no blue law for Saturdays. And it just seems crazy to me. The Americans have always kind of venerated the Ten Commandments, but it's obvious that our laws, our whole legal system is based on English common law and Roman law. There's just no question.
The Ten Commandments are really designed to do two things. Number one would be regulate humanity's relationship with the deity. That's why you have statements like "have no gods before me" and instructions about how to properly worship God. The second thing is lay down a series of fairly common sense regulations governing human behavior. People can't live together in a coherent society if they're killing one another, if they're stealing one another, if they lie. So those are fairly common regulations that appear in lots of different legal and moral codes over the years. So when people say that the Ten Commandments are somehow the foundation of American law, I have to shake my head, because for most of them, there is absolutely no reflection in our laws. You don't have to worship God in a certain way. You don't have to honor God in a certain way. You don't have to respect your parents. You don't have to honor the Sabbath. What I think people are really getting confused about is the idea that there was, back during the settlement of the United States, a very theocratic system in the Massachusetts Bay Colony that did, in fact, punish people for the way they behaved religiously. But that was a long time ago, and that system was replaced by a constitution whose First Amendment separates church and state. And I would also add that Article 6 contains a provision dealing with religious tests for public office, guaranteeing that everybody has the right to hold public office regardless of what they believe about God. So not only is our Constitution and our laws not based on the Ten Commandments, there are things in that Constitution that cut against the very words of the Ten Commandments.
The key is to look at the document, look at the Constitution, and say, all right, where are the Christian ideas? Closest you come is that although the word slavery is not in the Constitution, the idea of slavery is certainly enshrined in the Constitution. Even things like the Electoral College were affected by the slave states getting to have votes based on 3/5 of their population. Notably enough, 3/5 of the population who didn't get any fifths of a vote, but they were in fact counted. So in effect, those states, I live in one of them, Georgia, got more power in the Electoral College, and it affected Jefferson himself was elected with more votes from slave states. Now, slavery is defended and detailed ways in the Bible, and you can certainly make the case that slavery was a biblical institution. There's nothing in the Bible, not a single verse, that condemns slavery as being immoral. Leviticus 25 goes into considerable detail. That's in the Old Testament. Goes into considerable detail about what the rules are for slaves. You can take them from the tribes around you and so forth. You're much more restricted if you're a Hebrew, an Israelite, from enslaving your fellow Israelites. And you have to give them freedom in Jubilee years, but you don't with people from the tribes around you. Slavery certainly existed before the Bible was ever written. The Bible didn't invent slavery, and I don't think it's appropriate to blame Christians and Jews for creating slavery, but you can certainly say they didn't make any attempt to stop it. They didn't, the God of the Bible, if he existed, failed to indicate that slavery was immoral. Nearly all Americans now think it's immoral, and we, of course, have amended our Constitution so that slavery is not permitted in our country anymore. And that, of course, is another key difference between the Constitution and the Bible. You can't amend the Bible. There's no process that allows you to correct it and change it and throw out the bad stuff and keep the good stuff. But the Constitution can be amended.
People have a right to rebel against their governments, which is not supported by the Bible, and that's actually an anti-biblical belief. I mean, Jeff Sessions just yesterday was talking about, as was Sarah Huckabee Sanders, Romans 13 says you have to obey the authorities that are established because they are ordained by God. So to say that humans have the ability to rebel against their government is actually anti-biblical. And the Ten Commandments thing, I ended up devoting an entire part of my book to this claim because it's so frustrating. And there's so many questions that first are unanswered about that. The first question is, well, which set of Ten Commandments are you talking about that were so influential on American law?
They will not ask me in those interviews. I don't get a chance to bring up, hey, did you ever read Exodus 34?
And they won't answer the question either. If you ask them, I've never seen a legitimate answer of that. And then, well, which religion's interpretation of those 10 commandments? And it's not just the first commandment that violates the First Amendment. You can't have any other gods before me. You can't worship or make idols. I mean, that's free expression right there. Yes, you can. Can't misuse the name of the Lord. We've got free speech, baby. Jesus Christ. You can say it all you want. No, there's no. I mean, most of the commandments, actually, the way they are written in the Bible, if we're taking the Exodus 20 commandments as the commandments, violate the American set of laws that we have now. And one of the reasons is even the prohibitions on theft, rape, and murder, all of those, well, rape, of course, isn't in there. Excuse me, adultery. Because, why would you prohibit rape in your most moral set of laws, right? But even those commandments that we recognize as aligning with American law, in the Bible, they didn't apply outside of the in-group, right? It was only to your co-religionists that those commandments applied. And you can just read the chapters on either side of Exodus where they go out and slaughter, hundreds. I mean, they commit something like 70 genocides right after they're given the 10 commandments. So it's obviously okay to kill. It's just not okay to kill people who believe like you do, that concept is fundamentally opposed to the equality that we see under American law. So even the biblical formulations of those commandments that we recognize as, aligning are completely flawed and would not hold up under the U.S. Constitution if they were, a state government tried to pass them. They'd be struck down immediately. So, and I mean, the 10th commandment, that's thought crime. So we'll go ahead and say that that's thought is absolutely protected under the First Amendment. It's the one absolute right that we have under our Constitution. Every other right can be limited in some circumstances, but the freedom of thought is absolute and not under the 10 commandments. So almost all the 10 commandments can be said, not only did they not influence American law, they actually conflict with American law.
There is one part of the Constitution that very clearly does have biblical support and is informed by biblical morality. And I should also point out that people like Newt Gingrich have insisted that Benjamin Franklin ask for prayers to be used at the Constitutional Convention. And Newt Gingrich is right about that, but the things he's omitting are pretty important. We can talk about things like the body of the Constitution versus the signature in the year of our Lord, and the fact that, as Dr. What's her name, Baker pointed out, Sundays are not counted when you're counting number of days in between things according to the Constitution. She seemed to put a great deal of confidence in that.
There are a lot of old, antiquated provisions that deal with Sunday laws. I mean, we could get into that. It's very complicated. But to me, the fact that they have to kind of grasp at language like that to try to show that there's some sort of alleged religious influence in the Constitution is kind of amusing. If the founders had wanted this to be an officially Christian nation, if they had wanted there to be some connection to religion or Christianity, they would have stated that up front and center. They would not have written a wholly secular constitution. They would have put references to God in it. They would have put references to Jesus Christ in it. They would have put references to Christianity in it. Not only did they not do that, but they included a First Amendment that guarantees religious freedom, that separates church and state, and they put provisions in Article 6 guaranteeing everybody the right to hold public office. So the language in the Constitution, the plain language of the Constitution, cuts against this whole idea of the Christian nation. And I always tell people, look, you don't need to go beyond the plain text of the Constitution. And the reason you say that is because a lot of the people who who will promote this Christian nation idea, ironically, also venerate our Constitution, or claim to. Yet I sometimes wonder if they've actually read it, because they don't seem to know what's in it.
And specifically, James Madison, who was the founder of the Constitution, wrote, when he addressed the General Assembly of the state of Virginia, that we have staked the future of our political institutions upon our capacity to sustain ourselves according to the 10 Commandments of God.
That's a lie. That has been floating around for a long time, that Madison quote. David Barton, who's a notorious Christian nation propagandist based in Texas, was circulating it for a number of years. But even Barton has admitted that there's no original source for it. I'm kind of surprised that that's still out there, because it's been widely debunked. And some of the more honest Christian conservatives that are out there who study history, and there are such people, have admitted that nobody's been able to find a source for that alleged quote by Madison. In fact, that statement cuts against everything Madison ever wrote or ever stood for.
Dr. Baker gives you this wonderful quotation from James Madison, who basically, according to her, James Madison said, you can't govern without the 10 Commandments. But that's a fake quotation. That's false history. Should she have known that? I think she should have.
She recites a James Madison quote that James Madison did not say. It is a spurious quote. It takes 2 seconds of Googling to know that, even if you're not an expert in the field. That is a flat out lie. And it's a very easily checkable fact. Just go check it.
Madisonian scholars have shown that it would contradict everything else we know about Madison, and nobody can find it in a Madison text or book or letter or speech that he'd given or anything of the sort. So it is a false quotation. But the Christian right keeps using it anyway, and they have other false quotations from Washington and others.
Or if you really want to know Madison's thinking on the separation of church and state, I would recommend you read a little document he wrote in 1785 called the Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments, which, despite its unwieldy title, is a very succinct list of reasons why the government should not be in the business of supporting religion with tax money and favoring religion generally.
And if we look at all aspects of our law, equal justice under the law comes from the Bible and Deuteronomy. The concept of the Sixth Amendment to a speedy trial comes from the Bible, Ecclesiastics. The concept of frivolous lawsuits comes from the Bible.
Amy Jo,
and I
just
could
kind
go
of
on.
wrap that up, and then we'll ask questions.
Okay. So there's so many references to our law in the Bible that it would be wrong not to include that in our government course.
I once was attending a religious right conference, and I heard someone argue seriously that the United States system of 3 co-equal branches of government is based on the Trinity.
They have to grasp at straws and claim that some verse in the Old Testament, and Isaiah, I think it is, proves that the 3 branches of government were derived from biblical. And it's just absurd. They're really straining at gnats.
People will make any number of arguments to support their viewpoints. I'm not a biblical scholar, unlike Dr. Price, whose work I greatly respect. But I do know that from reading the Old Testament, you don't really see examples of democracy in action in the Old Testament. You see theocracies, you see autocratic kings, you see absolute control. You see a lot of things that were very common in the ancient world, but you don't really see examples of representative democracy. So there are people that are desperately trying to fit this square peg into a round hole, and it just doesn't work.
I guess the skin of the teeth for this position, the toehold in the Bible might be in I think it's Exodus 18, where Moses is hearing all cases from the people, which ancient kings did, like the story of Solomon and the prostitutes claiming each that the surviving baby is theirs. And it's up to Solomon to decide, well, yeah, that reflects what kings used to do. It's like people's court kind of. So Moses of course, there's no history to this. The whole thing is fictitious, but that doesn't matter. It is trying to promote a particular particular legal arrangement. Moses' father-in-law comes and sees how busy he is, that he has no time to gather his wits to get enough sleep. And he says, look, you're going to burn out. Why don't you appoint 70 subordinate judges to hear these cases, implicitly using the principles Moses' decisions have set forth, legal precedents. Okay, I remember when Moses addressed this. Well, we're going to apply that to your case, buddy. And so you do have a system of courts. That's true. And Moses is the final arbiter, sort of the Supreme Court. But to say that this is the basis, I mean, it's just an obvious idea in any kind of a government. It's not even commanded by God, right? It's Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, who makes this practical suggestion. To say that this is the divine basis. I mean, I'm one of the board members of Republican Atheists. I'm not some kind of wild-eyed pinko or something trying to undermine conservative values. No, I just hate to see them propped up by these phony arguments.
America was founded on the U.S. Constitution, which is an entirely godless document, and the source of that power is not supernatural, but right there in the first three words, we the people. It is a thoroughly human document.
That doesn't mean that there was no Judeo-Christian influence on our culture, our history, our Constitution. Our history, of course, started before we became a constitutional republic. And there was plenty of Christian influence in that.
I suspect what's going on here is a common confusion between those who founded the United States and wrote the Constitution and all that, and those people, of course, were, if anything, deists, universalists, and so on. Some conservative Christians too, but they're confusing that with the Pilgrims and the Puritans, which are in a sense pre-American. Our laws are explicitly not based on that. I mean, that's why we have a Constitution, to get away from the theocratic law of the Puritans and others. So it's just a historical blunder. I don't know how anybody can say that. And that's not to denigrate the Ten Commandments. It's not a question of that. It's just like if you said, well, we all know that the American legal system is based on the Islamic Sharia or the Hindu laws of Manu. What? It's just as ridiculous.
But the U.S. Constitution is secular. It begins invoking, not as nearly all documents of that sort did up until that point, it doesn't invoke a God. It invokes we the people. And it makes clear that authority flows from we the people. And there's nothing in the entire body of the Constitution that invokes any deities. And that's not an accident. The framers wrote at considerable length, Thomas Jefferson, for example, in his anticipating of Dr. Baker, that the common law was the basis, not the Ten Commandments, for our Constitution and our laws and our ideas about government.
The people are the source of the power, which again ties into the beginning of the Constitution. We, the people. It is not based on a supernatural power, for instance, the way the Ten Commandments are. The Ten Commandments begin, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no others before me. That's the source of power there. For America, we the people are the source of power. The two systems, in my mind, are fundamentally opposed. Judeo-Christianity is fundamentally opposed to the principles that this nation was founded on.
The First Amendment and the First Commandment are directly contradictory to each other. If people don't understand that, thou shalt have no other gods before me, or you will have freedom of religion, and of course, it's actually that as the Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's if in fact you're giving people religious liberty, you're directly contradicting the First Commandment.
Well, I agree that other religions have moral values. It's very clear, based on the founders themselves, have stated that they based a lot of our laws on the Judeo-Christian concepts found in the Old and New Testament. And as I was trying to point out, because time got away from us, that a lot of our laws that we have come from the Bible in terms of, like I said, the guarantee to a speedy trial, the concept of frivolous lawsuits, the concept of taking an oath in court, the concept of restitution in our courts, are just, there's laws regarding property, criminal and civil matters.
Right, ma'am, but I think
all
that,
of those.
I think that any one of those can also be, in some way, shape, or form, communicated through other faiths. So, and then, you know, one of the things in social studies, you know, this country is extremely diverse, and many individuals who've come to this country have come, you know, fleeing religious persecution. And so I think that it's really, it's responsible education when we're not specific to one faith over another. So while I understand, again, the focus, but on all of those tenets that you keep referring to, it's not specific to Christianity. That's one thing I want to try to have you understand. That is something that is pretty consistent across different religions, is the focus on this moral, this moral, being a moral human.
Well, with all due respect, we did not base our government from from Asia or Africa. It's based on Western civilization and the development over time, specifically from England. So, for example, the whole concept of the judicial branch comes from Isaiah and Deuteronomy and Judges, the whole concept of having judges in the court system. The concept of law, legislative, comes from the Bible. The concept of the executive branch comes from the Bible. In fact, Harry Truman said the fundamental basis of this nation's laws was given to Moses on the Sermon on the Mount.
That's just utterly ludicrous. What on earth? It's just another way of saying the same thing, but obviously she's a biblical literalist, but that doesn't matter. I mean, even if we knew that God exists and gave these laws to Moses, they just, as Rob has said very well, they're just not the basis of our laws. You can't find these connections, and whereas it's patently obvious that the real origin is the Western legal tradition from Greece and Rome on up through the Magna Carta, etc. I mean, what do you just erase that, or do you have to pretend that that the Greeks and Romans got their laws on which were dependent from the Bible? Like Philo of Alexandria used to say that Plato's philosophy is based on the Pentateuch of Moses. It's just absurd.
And I would add one thing to that. When folks attribute everything to Moses or the Ten Commandments, they rob us of the richness of the story. The story of the evolution of the law over many centuries is a fascinating story. Yes, you can go back and you can look at some of the ancient legal codes that did have an impact. Hammurabi, the Ten Commandments, yes, they had an impact, but they're not the end of the story. We also had Roman law, we had Augustus, we had Justinian in the Byzantine era, we had Greek lawgivers. And if you go down to the U.S. Supreme Court in the main chamber, it's really fascinating because they have this frieze along the wall. And the frieze depicts the evolution of the law over many centuries. So yes, Moses is there, but he's only one of many historic lawgivers. You have the ancient Roman lawgivers, you have the Greek lawgivers, you have Napoleon up there because of Napoleonic law, and English lawgivers, and the English development of the English common law. So I guess what really offends me is, just like the creationists piss me off because they rob children of the richness of an amazing story with a much more simplistic tale. The Christian nation people do the same thing. They take this incredible story of how we forged this nation from a small band of theocrats to this amazing country where all religious and non-religious perspectives are protected and, I would hope, respected. They rob us of that story. They rob our children of that story, and they replace it with something that is just completely ridiculous and simplistic. So not only are they factually wrong, they're offensive, I think, from an educational standpoint, because they're failing to tell the whole story, which is a teacher's first duty.
I would point out the fact that we are talking about a course in history. And so this is talking about early American history, our government, and our the different historical things. So in this sense, you're talking about Judeo-Christian. It was Judeo-Christian that created what we have. Whether that's found in other religions or not is not relevant in this case, because what you're doing is talking about the basis of what our government came from. So in that sense, I think Dr. Baker has that's what you're trying to say. That's
Yes.
where it originated with for our country. And I might say that if those things were so prevalent in other places in the world, it's kind of interesting that they haven't shown up that much in other places of the world.
Yes, exactly.
That's a rather provincial view of how our government is wonderful and everybody else's is terrible. It's standard fare, but that doesn't make it correct or reasonable. Exactly what counts as moral and what counts as immoral has varied throughout human history, and different governments have had different ideas about it. And our government, for the first time in human history, or for the first major time in human history, did favor protecting minority views and individual rights as opposed to collective rights. But that's not biblical. It's not even, in fact, it's anti-biblical. If you read Romans, and this is New Testament, of course, it advises you that authority rests with the rulers, and you should not, and that the rulers were instituted by God, and that you shouldn't rebel against them. And this is in an era when there weren't any democratic elections. The rulers were certainly not instituted by the voters. So
Yeah, it's astonishing what people think the Bible teaches. Like there is, in my opinion, virtually no sexual morality taught in the Bible outside of no adultery. And even there, it's a little foggy, because the same people that promulgated that allowed for polygamy and so on. But there's no explicit commandment against premarital sex, except as a matter of property rights, that the father owned the virgin, and if she got corrupted by some rascal, then she was used goods, and he couldn't get the dowry he hoped for, the bride price, to marry her off. I mean, that's the way it's dealt with. They just didn't have the same sort of moral issues sometimes that we have, or if they did, they're based on totally different factors like honor and shame, and a whole different moral compass. And the issue of warfare, if you want to say that, well, the Bible says you should have war if you need to, well, that's not quite what you get in the Old Testament, where you have theocratic jihads against Canaanites and so on, who were all imagined to be evil, sort of like the orcs in the Lord of the Rings. Or you're going to get it out of the New Testament, where the question doesn't even come up, nor could it, because the earliest Christians had no participation in government. They couldn't have a war. They had no army. It's just out of the question. It's like saying, do Jehovah's Witnesses have armies? Well, thank God, no. But it's just so absurd. They're really thinking of maybe Victorian morality or something, or maybe just civil religion. That's where Americanism itself is a kind of a quasi-religion to mask the problem of religious diversity, a problem only in the sense that it makes unanimity in the population more difficult. But you're right, it's just not biblical morality. Even if you don't want to criticize biblical morality, it's just not the same thing, and it's absurd to pretend that it is. I have a Bible that has, I guess it was put up in the bicentennial, and they've got obviously the text of the Bible, but also the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution bound into the same book. And this is ironically funny to me, because it's like you got a huge contradiction between the two sections. Forget about idolatry, making the founding documents of America, which I love, into part of the Bible. It's just hopeless confusion.
So it's just absurd on its face to claim that Christian morality, Christian principles were what informed the U.S. Constitution. It's, there are all sorts of implicit moral questions included, and some of those reinforce what Christians consider to be good moral points of view, but they're not uniquely Christian. They go to the whole idea of every religion that we know of.
Look, I mean, there are many great things about this country, and there are lots of reasons why people do want to come here. And I think chief among them is the fact that we have in writing, appended to our Constitution, a guaranteed Bill of Rights. And it includes religious freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of press, protection against unlawful searches and seizure, lots of things. And I think what's different about our list is that we have a court system and a legal system that can enforce it, that can give it voice. There are a lot of countries that could list those types of rights. The Soviet Union used to do that. They had this constitution that had this nice sounding list of rights, but it was only paper. It didn't have anything backing it up. We have a different system here. So people, I think, are naturally excited by that. They want to be a part of that. And that's why a lot of folks come here. And it's not because we have this kind of religious totalitarianism where everybody has to think alike. It's just the opposite. You can decide for yourself what, if anything, you believe about faith. That is a powerful motivating factor for a lot of people, especially those who have lived under the iron heel of religious oppression, which we know exists in our world today. You don't have to look far to see examples of that.
Dr. Baker, I want to make sure we're not talking about Christian values, we're talking about Judeo-Christian values and monotheism being the influence on not 2018, but on our founding fathers, right? The basis of our government.
Yes.
I want to make sure we all understand. We're talking about what influenced the founding fathers, and it was Judeo-Christian values, and it was monotheism.
There's a couple of different ways that could be true. I mean, just theoretically in a vacuum, you could say it's based on monotheism in that the one true God gave laws that we have to follow just because he gave them. That's obviously not the case here. Our system is not founded on such a belief. On the other, you could say, as some of the deists did, and I guess you find in the Declaration of Independence, that you're simply anchoring the I don't know what the status of this is in philosophy these days, but you could just say that there are natural rights and obligations and so on that God created. But this, in the deist sort of a framework, meant that the basic laws are derived from nature via reason. Where did that come from? Oh, I guess the creator made it. But the emphasis is on the inherent rationale and the derivation. Well, even Thomas Aquinas said this, that the laws are not arbitrary. They're based on human nature and human needs. And where did that come from? Oh, well, the creator. But it's not just divine command ethics. God said to stand on your head every Wednesday afternoon, so we're going to do it. I mean, there's nothing like that. And I think you could say some of the framers believe the latter, but they don't use divine command theory, which is lurking behind all affirmations that the Bible is a revelation from God and we got to do it. So if it says, like the Christian Reconstructionists say, you've got to stone adulterers, well, let's do it. You got to kill homosexuals, okay, well, let's do it. Like Rousas John Rushdoony, who wrote Institutes of Biblical Law, I think the foundational text for Christian Reconstructionism, that is simply divine command ethics, and though its advocates do also try to rationalize it, I don't think they're fooling anybody. So if that's what you mean by dependent on monotheism, forget it. That's just a caricature.
And I would add this, as someone who's been tracking religious right groups for 31 years, I've noticed that when they use this term Judeo-Christian, that always gets my antenna up, because what they usually mean by that is it's just a cover for whatever extreme public policy proposal they may be seeking at the time. Their Judeo-Christian ethics would in fact be rejected by many Jews and many Christians of a moderate or a progressive bent. And in fact, the Judeo part was really just added in recent years. It's really just a cover for extremely conservative Christian fundamentalist politics. And I would also say this. I think one of the things we need to keep in mind here is that, while yes, there are many great and wonderful things under our system, it's not perfect. There are a lot of people these days who recognize that our social safety net, for example, is pretty tattered, has a lot of holes in it. They look at the societies of Western Europe and the social safety nets and the welfare states that they created post World War II, see that really utterly disconnected from religion, done as a purely secular thing to provide a standard of living for people that we have in some ways fallen short of in this country. So when I hear folks talk about Judeo-Christian ethics on the right, what they're usually talking about is bootstrap capitalism and what I call the Heritage Foundation Jesus, who's just a Jesus who parrots all the right-wing Republican, extremely conservative talking points, and basically says that, well, we're not really going to have any kind of system of help for people if they need it, because that's not biblical. Well, there are a lot of Christians who would strongly disagree with that interpretation of Judeo-Christian ethics.
Well, here, let's just do this. If you were, for instance, to read the Federalist Papers, which James Madison wrote and which Alexander Hamilton wrote and John Jay wrote, these are three of the greatest legal minds of that generation. James Madison is known as the father of the Constitution. They cite all of the sources of law that they used. And this is, these are pages and pages and pages of the thoughts of the founders and the sources that they used. And the Bible's not in any of that. Not once. You got Greek, you've got Roman law, you've got Old English common law, you've got all these sources of law, and the Bible's not there. The Ten Commandments aren't there. That it did not influence them at all. If anything, it actually influenced them on how not to create a nation. Jefferson and Madison did often look to the colonies farther north, the Puritans and the Pilgrims, and said, this is what happens when you have a government that is fully united with a church. It kills society. It's a cold, colorless society that does not function well. And they actually said, you know what, we're going to avoid that example and go a completely different route and keep state and church separate. So the only way that the Bible influenced the formation of the American government was as a way, something to avoid. It was an example of what not to do.
Well, John Adams wrote a defense of the Constitution of the United States. It was published in England in 1787. And he was at some pains to say that, and I could give you the exact quote, but it gets boring to have people quoting things. You can look this up in a lot of different places. He said, no one will ever say that we had conversations with the gods about this. We only used our reason and developed this. And he gives you hundreds of precedents of other kinds of governments, of preceding gods and religious entities and that sort of thing that have been involved in the development of governments. And he makes it clear that's not what we did. And it is also under his presidency that a treaty was announced as a treaty with an Islamic country. People tend to think that our relations are bad relations, often enough, with Islamic countries or some new phenomenon. But the Barbary pirates attacked our ships and made slaves out of our seamen. And in George Washington's administration, a fellow by the name of Joel Barlow, went and negotiated a treaty. It was ratified by or passed by the U.S. Senate unanimously. And by the time it was actually issued, John Adams was the one who issued it. And that treaty said that as the government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, and then goes on to reassure the people in the Bey, who was the leader of the Barbary of Tripoli, that we weren't going to go to war based on religion. So this is clear statement. This was 1796, 1797. It was only 10 or 11 years after the U.S. Constitution. The Constitution itself is all the evidence we need. Despite what Dr. Baker said, there's nothing in the Constitution that is Christian.
This is in many ways a debate about history. And one of the amazing things about this country is that our history is so rich and so exciting and so vibrant. To think that we started out with the European settlers, a handful of European settlers in a theocratic area of New England, and are where we are today, a vibrant, diverse, incredible society of believers and non-believers struggling to live side by side, not always getting it right, but essentially, and at the end of the day, yeah, we do usually come out on the right side of these things because of our tradition of religious freedom, because of our tradition of separation of church and state. That's an exciting story, how we got there. And it offends me when people turn their backs on that story and want to substitute a myth instead. The real story is fascinating enough that our children need to hear it. They deserve to hear it.
That is what I've felt for a long time about creationism and evolution, that you say, oh yes, God just made it one thing after another, and what a miracle. I think, do you know anything about evolution? Because that is astonishing, mind-blowing, and just based on an inductive study of evidence, it's far more amazing than the myth that is invoked. You just it's the creation thing is more mundane than the scientific fact, so it's like dumbing down and robbing our children. Just as you say, it fits both ways. One thing I would add is that I understand and respect what I think motivates people that are trying to say this is a Christian nation, it's based on the Bible. What is important about it is that, as Peter Berger and others describe, every traditional society had a sacred canopy of values that were secured by a myth of a divine foundation. God gave the law to Moses or to Muhammad or whatever, and this worked in a culture where everyone basically held to the traditional religion because it was an anchor for the ultimacy, the unquestionability of the values. Oh, God made it this way. Well, that's myth, but it's a way of saying, look, we've got to have some overarching set of values we can agree on, or it's going to be chaos. Well, religious pluralism, the basic condition of the modern world, makes that very difficult. And so pragmatically, people came up with the idea of civil religion. Okay, we got Jews, Christians, increasingly Muslims, Hindus, and others. What's going to provide a common canopy for our values? Well, civil religion. We're not going to call it a religion. We can't say if you realize you can't say the Bible is the basis of law, How about treating something else like the Bible? How about having a constitution that we cannot just overthrow? We can all agree on that, right? And then of course the issues of how to interpret the Bible and the Constitution become parallel. So that's a problem. But what about sacred founders? Well, the church fathers, okay, that's restricted to religion. How about the founding fathers? We can't really question their wisdom, and they were real wise. How about religious icons? Gee, I guess we can't do that, but the flag. Like, why was there such a hue and cry, understandably, about flag burning? That really upsets me, but it's because surely it's a free speech issue, but it's so incendiary, no pun intended, because it's blasphemy, right? The flag is sacred. Now, it's not supposed to be, but that's what's going on. We don't have a Christ because that's exclusively Christian. But how about Abe Lincoln, the slain savior who saved the United States from division? And holidays, well, all right, we can't have those officially, but how about July 4th? Holiday is a holy day. That's the derivation. So that worked for a while. It was sort of a stopgap. And now that's crumbling pretty obviously. And I understand the result would be Durkheim or Weber, I forget, called anomie, a state of lawless disorientation, and things become chaotic, and that is happening in many ways. So I really sympathize with the right-wing Christians who want to restore this North Star of some sacred canopy. And I think we're losing that in the modern or the postmodern setting. And it's a high price to pay, but it's not, it doesn't justify taking myths as history and trying to control people through false claims such as we're seeing in this mess.